Alright, what's up guys, Zero here, and we're back once again for our monthly tier list. This month, a lot more decks than usual, just because we had Fighters Collection, and that did give us a few decks from that set that are actually pretty good. Spoiler alert, none of those decks are the GR Reliant decks, they're all triple rare decks, like triple rare strike decks, so without further ado, let's start with the tier list. So, S tier, the best decks, the tip of the top, the cream of the crop, whatever you want to call it, the best decks of the format. Of the current format. A tier, good decks or decks that have a really good gimmick to them that make them good against certain other really good decks that actually matter. So like either solid decks that just aren't the best, or decks that have some sort of gimmick that keeps them there. Because there are actually a few decks for once that I think that have a very specific gimmick that make them good against some decks, but not all decks. But overall, I do think they are better than the stuff which is in B tier. Which for me, B tier is just bare minimum playable decks, like not terrible, not amazing. They're playable, but they're not good or anything, or like they don't have anything to make them stand out or anything. So yeah, like very fair decks, I guess that's what I put. So without further ado, let's start. So I'll just do them in order, and I'll do them all in order, but I'll leave the new ones for last. So without further ado, let's start. First off, Altmile. I think Altmile is very just a very fair deck. Nothing too unfair, not particularly good or anything, just very playable, it's okay deck, amazing, not terrible. And strides are okay, all my stride bonus is pretty good because they're cycle stuff, but overall as a deck, I don't think it's particularly amazing, regardless of which build you play. I do think the Jewel Knight build of this deck is better, but even that build has its own share of issues, and I do think that just comes from the fact that none of the Royal Paladin strides are particularly amazing right now. Honorable mention goes to MLB. I think MLB should also be here. I just forgot to put it here, but MLB would also be here just because it's a deck that can go first. Big Crit Monkey, very scary too because of a Religious Soul Saver, but that deck probably would be around the same power level as Altmile. Probably a little bit worse, so that's why I didn't put it here. So yeah. Revengers. It is technically a old deck, but it did get its support in the form of its strides, and in my opinion, at least, if you see my deck profile for this deck, there is a triple rare grade 3 that you're playing from the new set in this deck. At least I'm playing. So if you want to find out what that is, go watch that video. But regardless, I think this deck is very much an S tier deck. I think the deck before is already pretty playable, not like terrible, not like amazing or anything without the strides. But ever since getting its strides, both Aura Geyser and Diablo are pretty good additions to the deck. Just added an extra toolbox. Aura Geyser is pretty good first stride to help you trade your garbage on the board into actual, or hopefully good cards in your hand. And Diablo is an alternate way to help you end games too, whether it just be with the crit or the glory effect from the crit. So overall, just having a good toolbox in your G zone is pretty nice for this deck, and I think that actually was all it needed to go back into like the tippy top toe of the competitive deck. So that's why I think this deck is here. Again, these three decks are new, so I'll save these for later. The Cross, I think it's very much an A tier deck. It's not amazing, not terrible. It gets dicked on very hard by Vanquisher, but other than that, the deck is still overall pretty solid deck. Legions, Legions, that's not bad. Its G zone is pretty good. Using Dote is still a pretty strong effect. You just gotta play other things like your Soul Blast and Counter Charge now, so obviously that sucks, but you just go to stuff like Bell Costy to Counter Charge. You could use stuff like the Jane Nail to Soul Blast, or the Volcano Gale to Soul Blast, but definitely got worse. Definitely nowhere near as good as it is on Global right now, where it's full power, unnerfed, but even with the nerfs, deck still pretty playable. Not amazing, but not terrible either. Next up, we got Blademaster. I think this is the superior Kagero variant, but I do think it has been bumped down from S tier. Now, last month I put this deck in S tier, but I think overall the power of the game just has gone out like a little bit higher, just not that much, but I think it is enough to bump this deck down. I do think it's still a very good deck. Don't get me wrong, but like this deck still has the same issue it had before of just it's reliant on retiring your opponent's board. That's its deck's entire game plan. If your opponent deck just doesn't care about board, or they don't give you a board to retire, you're not having a good time because your deck just lost its like the thing that it does. So yeah, definitely doesn't help that Shadows constantly sack off their own board. So they can like kind of control what you want to retire with them. Like if they just sack off, never have a column. Brute Flare is very low value. If they only have back row, you can Mustafa for it or Mahmood for it, but then that just isn't like that strong of a value. So I do think that Revengers being a good deck now does hinder Blademaster a bit because it just screw over its gimmick of constantly able to control board, while Revengers just get rid of their own board for themselves for cost. So I do think there's that. So yeah, because Revengers are a good deck again, or a better deck again. Blademaster does lose that on its gimmick a little bit, just having a not very fun match against that in general. And again, the fact that the deck is rare, relying on your opponent putting out a board for you to do anything is not the best. Decks that require interaction from your opponent is probably isn't as good because your opponent can very much play around your deck gimmick. So yeah, that's it. That's Blademaster. New Tom is technically in deck, so I'll say that for later. Brawlers, they're only on here. They're on here because they did get a new stride from the Fighters collection. They got the Big Manacle Turbo, which basically is a stride version of pre-nerf Knuckle Buster for the most part. So I'll put this deck in A tier. I do think it's better than everything else that I'm going to put into B tier. But yeah, the deck is literally the same thing now. The only thing is that you take out the Teorox for Chituras now because and you put in the grade 1 Kokon, I think, the grade 1 scaler. Because if you read Teorox, he only works if you're in Legion state, and you want to actually be striding every turn into the Turbo, so that card loses ability to scale. You still might play for the resist, but regardless if you play that or not, the fact that Teorox doesn't work if you're on or can't use the scaling skill while you're on Turbo really sucks as a hindrance to the deck. So I do think the deck got worse after the nerfs and choice restrictions and stuff like that. And even with the stride helping it be playable again, I do think that it is nowhere near where it used to be, so I do think it's like closer to the tail end of A tier. So I'll just leave that there for now. Next off, a deck that is in the higher echelon of A tier, for me, is Vanquisher. I put this deck here just because this deck gatekeeps a bunch of decks from being good. Any Legion deck has to be wary of this deck because, oh yeah, there also is the thing that Vanquisher is still a Narukami, or not Vanquisher, Brawlers are still a Narukami deck, so they do still have access to Zoras to help bind drop them if you need to in some matchups, so that also lets it be more relevant than it really should be. So yeah, but back to Vanquisher. Buying any deck that needs their drop zone to do anything just gets screwed super hard by this deck. The reason I think this deck can't be any higher up is because this deck just dies super hard to resist intercept. Any deck that can put out resist intercept, this deck just kind of folds to it. If they want to push damage, they're forced to go into Vermilion or Crimson, or I guess essentially the same card, right? But you're forced to go off of those cards because all of this deck's front row attire that isn't Crimson that just punches into it is targeting, so you cannot get rid of the resist intercepts with just staying on Vanquisher and with Conquest. Well, it kind of really sucks, but this deck is overall just a relatively solid deck. It's not like game-breakingly broken, that's why it's here, but it does gatekeep a bunch of decks from being good, while itself being overall solid all around, but getting screwed super hard by one thing in particular, and that doesn't help its case being to make it push for me. You want to push this in S tier. Good deck, not terrible. Definitely has its uses. Definitely a good deck. Definitely has a case. Definitely has some really good gimmicks to go with it. So yeah, A tier. I think like top of A tier is a very good place to put just because it is like the quote gatekeeper deck of the meta. So yeah. Next up, Victor. I think this deck goes in B tier. It's just not. It's just as I like to put it, I think this deck is just bad Aqua Force. It is Aqua Force, but worse in every way. It has a lower ceiling. You don't draw as much. It is literally Aqua Force, but worse in every single way. So it's not terrible or anything. It's a very playable deck, but I'm never scared running into it. It doesn't do anything particularly special or anything. It goes second. It can kind of push your face in, but that's pretty much every deck. So I do think it's definitely a B tier at best deck. Next off, we have this is new. I think this is the definition of an A tier deck. A tier, tier 2, what do you want to call this tier? I think it is probably in the middle of somewhere around here, this area. I think these two are pretty interchangeable, but I'll just put this here. The deck, I was allowed to put this. I think this deck is old Kagero without. It's basically Kagero without Conroe. The deck does. They're both very similar. They both live and die by seeing draw triggers to get cards in their hand. What this deck is really good at, though, is that once you push your opponent to 5, they basically have the option to just ignore heal cards completely. If you stride, your Vanguard is over one heal card to hit. It gets 2 heal cards or more to block. You have the mate to the Rune Disposal that asks for PGs only. You have Ragnarok that asks for PGs only. So this deck is really good just ignoring grade zeros, the heal cards. But so yeah, it has it works well enough that I don't want to put it down here with these decks, because its gimmick of ignoring heal guards is pretty, or having multiple ways of guard restricting is pretty nice. So that is a really relatively good way to close games off. Has a Legion if they need it. Has draw power in the GG, which is like fine, I guess. But this deck's strongest point is definitely its guard restricts and having a very toolboxy G zone, mainly Fate Rider. But I do think this deck is solid all around, not amazing, not terrible. Definitely somewhere in the middle of A tier. I think it's the definition of a tier 2 deck. It has good tools. It has a card that pluses you. Has a very good G zone. I think that's the main thing that keeps it alive. It has a very, very good G zone. And yeah, that's it. That's very, very well-rounded deck. The only thing is that you are still living and dying by seeing draw triggers every once in a while, for the most part. But other than that, this deck is very solid. Next up, we have duos and all the other fish decks. So I'll just put all three at once. So right now, I actually think duos are the best deck. I think Mirror is somewhere beside this deck as well. But I do think Loris is one tier lower than these decks. The other two decks. So let's talk around all three of them at once. So duos, they're just good. Turns out their nerfs basically didn't do anything. You just play other good cards now. You take out the Kuras, and then you put in Stride Fodder. You put in the Great One Shizuku. You can keep playing the Filter. You can play the Ural now for the Soul Last 2 draw one. You can play whatever other great ones that you can fit in those slots now. So yeah, you lost Kura, kind of sucks. Sometimes it comes a little awkward, but turns out your G zone's really good. Olivia's a really good card for this deck. Somni can help you push damage for free. The Fire Collection also gives this card access to Nectaria, which is a very good stride because it just dupes anything you want. And then obviously Olivia is a pretty solid finisher. If you want to play Spiccas, you can fit space in for those. Because overall, they got like some pretty solid main deck conclusions, and they have a really good G zone too. Turns out duping PGs, duping whatever you want is still really good. So yeah, this deck has been good since release. This deck is still good now. I think it's the best deck now. So yeah, just very, very versatile deck. Mirror, I think it's a little under duos. Mirror is good. It still plays the duo stuff in the deck. If you want, it plays the duo stuff in the deck. You can still play like Roan, PGs, Clancy. So that's still a really strong package. Roan being able to dupe your PGs and stuff. Mirror being a duo also means that anything that requires duo for whatever reason also works with it. So yeah, just you're less defensive. You don't have access to Legion. So that's a good and a bad thing. No Legion means you don't last that well into late game, as well as something like duos. It's good because you don't get decked down by Vanquisher. But this deck can still put out resist intercepts. But the thing that this deck has over duos is that it has a much stronger kill turn. This deck will ask for consistently they have access to the Mirror combo. They still have access to Olivia, and since they're not duo centric or Legion centric for the deck, you don't have to play Vepr in the deck, meaning you have space to actually max out on Spica, so your kill turns are more threatening. You even past double intercepts at 5, an Olivia turn with a Spica is asking for what is it, 1, 2, 3 PGs or 3 guards. That's still pretty good. And then a Mirror turn is even stronger, as you can loop multiple Spicas and you have multiple Vanguard attacks. So lower defensive ceiling, much higher kill ceiling, but I think that higher defensive ceiling from the duos is slightly better than the kill ceiling of Mirror. But other than that, they're both basically the same deck, and or they play very similar in how that works, because having a duo Vanguard does make a difference, because having a duo Vanguard means you can use you're gonna stride into Nectaria and get free dupes if you need to. And then finally you have what's her name again? Loris, right? Loris. This deck is just it's a deck that doesn't have the defensive ceiling of duos, nor does it have the kill ceiling of Mirror. So it's in that spot where it's a solid deck. I don't think it's bad or anything. I do think it's probably the best A-tier deck here. The only issue here is that they don't have anything that makes them stand out as compared to the other two fish decks. So that's why I think it's worse than here. You could make an argument to put it at the end of here, but I've tried this deck myself, and like Loris is just a super underwhelming card to be on. Like in this deck, I personally play the Victoria as my backup ride, and I'd rather be on Victoria than on Loris. That just goes to show how bad Loris is of the cards. But this deck isn't bad by any means, not amazing. Just that why would you play Loris when you play the other two fish decks? So yeah, that's it for that. That's it for all three of the fish decks. And then finally we have actually 2 more decks. I put Liberators back on here because they did get access to their G zone. I do think that they're a B tier deck. Their G-Zone is nice, but it's nothing amazing. Very similar to something like Altmile, where they have a okay, very simple G-Zone, not amazing, not terrible, but I do think that G-Zone does bump it back up to a playable degree. I do also think it's the best Gold Paladin deck, so if I'm putting this deck here, you'll probably know where Gurgurt goes, so it does, Liberators do Liberator things, now they have a real G-Zone, so yeah, playable deck, not amazing, not terrible. Next up, we have Aqua Force. I do think this deck belongs here as well. Where you put this is up to you, but I do think it's probably worse than the other two fish decks, but this deck, highest ceiling in the game. You go second, you'll just run them over. As long as you see some amount of draws, keep your hand up, or you don't have too many defensive, so you can actually use your Algos Tactic Sailor columns to draw cards. Very good, very good deck. Thavas itself is kind of whatever, but Lambros is a very good stride. You know, two turns of Lambros and they should be dead. Every deck should be dead by then. So yeah, go second, win game, high ceiling, high skill ceiling. Just solid all around deck. They have. Although this deck is very board reliant, they do draw enough cards for the most part to keep replenishing their board every turn to keep up with the opponent. So board removal is annoying for them, but it's not the most annoying thing just because they do have the draw power to keep their board back up. So yeah, very solid deck. Actually, it's a little shaky of a deck, but the stupid ceiling of this deck is just so high that I think this deck belongs up here just because of how strong the kill swing of Lambros is. So yeah. And finally, we are left with all the new decks. So I'll go through the 3 Fighters Collection decks first. So that being Machinings, Nubatama, and Metalborgs. So I covered all 3 decks. I think these 3 decks are all pretty solid overall. And I do think they are all A-tier decks. This can go here, this can go... I think Borgs are the best out of this bunch. And I think the order is something like this here. Borgs, they have really good draw power. And it turns out Glory every single turn is a pretty good win condition when every deck is tossing Great 3s to Stride. Eventually they will run out. They either have to stop playing the game to not Stride, to respect the Duke, or they Stride, can't kill you, and then they die to the Duke. So, turns out, Glory every turn with a deck that has pretty solid draw power is a pretty good deck. So, pretty solid deck. I think it does belong somewhere in here, somewhere in this tier for now. Time will tell if it stays here, but for now I do think it belongs here. Nubatama. The deck itself doesn't plus at all whatsoever, but this deck does screw over other decks that also lack in draw power, or is very piece reliant. So this deck can definitely screw over something like Aqua Force, where it needs cards in hand and on board that they can get rid of both. Stuff like Kagero and Narukami and Gears don't generate too much advantage, so Nubas can screw over those decks as well. Yeah, it's very good at controlling the pace. It's pretty good at controlling the pace of the game, as well as screwing over any decks that don't generate a shit ton of advantage. But this deck does die pretty hard to decks that do plus a lot. I think this deck dies pretty bad to both Bermuda decks, or any Bermuda deck. Shadows is a mixed bag. It's like kind of even, I'd say. And stuff like Liberators or Gurgurt decks that can just plus from nowhere is pretty solid against this deck because they can just play like turn by turn on a turn by turn basis, just filling up their board with the cards that play down every turn. So, or just enough cards to play down every turn. So yeah, it's a very finicky deck. Don't think it's terrible. Don't think it's amazing either. That's why I do think it belongs in the lower end of A tier. But I do think it does something relevant enough that puts it better than all the decks in B tier, because these decks are very simple. They do their thing and that's it. They don't do anything that's super degenerate. This deck can actually be pretty degenerate against the decks that don't generate enough advantage to keep up with them. So I think this deck goes here. And finally, Machinings. Machinings are also in a very similar boat as Nubatama. Any deck that can't function without their Vanguard for multiple turns will eventually run out of either re-rides or stuff to run out of re-rides to deal with this deck. But this deck does have a bunch of counterplay to it, just because this deck, the Stride does need you to have a fully rested board to work. So if your opponent just puts down anything with resist into the back row, your Stride just stops working, because you cannot target that thing with resist. And as long as that thing is standing, your opponent's Vanguard is not paralyzed, and Machine Destroyer just became a CB2 paralyzed rear guard, and that's kind of not very good. So yeah, there's that, as well as the fact that something like Messiah can unlock yourself a stand, meaning unless you have multiple ways to paralyze their entire back row, they do get away with knocking your Vanguard paralyzed as well. So yeah, it's one of those decks where it's it does well against some decks, but against certain other matchups, just doesn't do anything at all whatsoever. So That's why I think it's definitely near these two decks are near the tail end of the A tier, just because they have heavy counterplay. Some decks they either have heavy counterplay to their decks, or some decks just do very well against them. Is this big? So yeah. Let's get to some water real quick, and we will finally talk about the new decks from set 3. So Diablo, this is like the Diablo Focus deck where you're actually riding the Blaster Diablo and striding Diablo as often as possible. I think this is just another B tier deck. This deck does nothing unfair at all whatsoever. It's just a very simple deck. You can go to Aura Geyser to draw cards. You can go to Grim Revenge to get back row. Or you can stride Diablo as your first driver on Blaster Diablo to just get free retire off. So yeah, nothing special about this deck. It's just very fair. It does okay things, not terrible or anything, but it also doesn't do anything special. So I definitely do think it's here. Nothing super overwhelming. Doesn't help that all your Grade 2s suck as well. So yeah, there's that. Yeah, pretty whatever deck. Same with Gurgrit. Gurgrit is here for a different case. I do think it's a multitude of things. Let's put it like this. I do think it's a multitude of things just because of the fact that your G zone isn't particularly amazing, and since this deck is constantly ripping cards out of its own deck, you will eventually just run out of gas and ability to do anything. Because think about it, Gurgrit's GB2 is mill 1. All the call skills call 1 card off the deck, 1 card off the top of their deck, so that's 1 extra card gone. Gurgrit's GB2 is an extra card gone, or stride bonus is an extra card gone. Pi will call the card from deck, that's another card gone. Your best extender, in my opinion, the Lopier, is another card out of your deck. So at some point, you'll play the game, you'll do your gameplay, and you'll look at your deck count and you realize, wow, how am I already in single-digit deck counts? And you realize that, oh yes, I was pulling cards out of my deck with every single play I was doing. So the issue, deck out is a concern. Running out of gas is an issue with this deck too, because of yourself ripping your cards out of the deck every single turn like that. You also have the issue of this deck. Yes, it doesn't die because of Gurgrit's GB2, but at the same time, since you're not taking damage, you don't get counterblast back to do your plays. And speaking of your plays, your kill pressure is very low. I think this deck's highest high roll is like, I don't know, like Call a Spirit off of Gurgrit's GB2. And then Pi will call Lopier call like a Pelennor, and then that gets you like some extra attacks to face, but that's a super high roll play, and as well as the fact that you need a bunch of resources for that, so I think this deck has a bunch of issues overlaying it, making it not very good, but it's playable, I guess, but like, playable is as good as I'd put it. It does have the niche of dealing with certain matchups. Dicks on Aqua Force pretty well. I think that's the best thing about it, is that it has a really good Aqua Force matchup. That's about it. Next up, another deck that has a really good Aqua Force matchup is Messiah. I think Messiah does belong somewhere here. I think I actually put it somewhere here. I think put it in the higher end of A tier. It turns out Big Crunch is a pretty good stride. Just lock column, pretty good. Forces them to either keep their column locked in return, or forces them to go into Big Crunch to deal with it. So, it has all the tools it needs to be a good deck. It has okay draw power. Alter Ego strike bonus is pretty good. Although it's not a hard lock where it locks your opponent's card for like the entire turn, it does force some really awkward situations for your opponent sometimes. If they want to play something specific in that slot, they can't do that anymore. Something like Conquest's power bonus that gives power during the main phase doesn't work anymore. If your opponent if your thing you locked with that isn't an intercept, they can never get rid of it unless they can call something over during the battle phase. So there's that too. But oh yeah, overall relatively solid deck. Amnesi's a pretty good first strike because you can just push with crit. And then Big Crunch just constantly pressuring a lock for cheap every turn is also pretty good because Big Crunch plus Messiah is 2 front row locks, and you just go face 3 times, which is solid enough. So I do think it belongs here because lock is still a pretty good mechanic, right? In 0, so yeah. And finally, we have Claret Sword. I saved this for last, so it must be good, right? And no, it is so bad. I'm going to create a new tier for this deck. That's how bad I think this deck is. Yes, we will have a C tier for once. C for Claret Sword. Can't spell. C for Claret. This deck belongs here. I think this deck is the worst deck here by far whatsoever. I don't even think it's as good as these decks. I think this deck is a whole tier under. This is the pure Claret deck that like Claret is your main stride. But the thing is, if Claret is your main stride, you shrine to Diablo. Diablo's kind of mediocre because it's basically just a crit and retire. Because you don't have to retire from the Blaster Dark Diablo. None of your strides push damage. Claret doesn't push damage. Your rears don't push damage. So you're forced to play aggro triggers. Just as I can't facilitate aggro triggers, but any deck that needs to use aggro triggers to push damage is, in my opinion, a really bad deck. You don't even have the gimmick that something like Imperial Daughter has of being this obnoxious 21k Vanguard. Yeah, the deck just doesn't do anything. It doesn't kill you, doesn't not die. It just kind of sits there. It just kind of sits there hoping that your opponent dies, when they won't, because they'll kill you before that happens. So yeah, I think this deck is I think if trying to play pure Claret is the most copium shit you could do. This deck is terrible. Claret is at most just like a one-off filler in some decks. So yeah. So that's it for this month's tier list. Tell me what you guys think about below in the comments. Like and subscribe to the good stuffs, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.